afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the University of Arizona Southwest Center, I want to welcome you to our online panel discussion, the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance, Collaborative Conservation in a Polarized West. We're thrilled that you're able to join us this afternoon, and thank you for your time and interest in this really important topic. I'd like to remind everyone that the University of Arizona occupies the territory of the Tohono O'odham, Pascua Yaqui, and Apache peoples, and that we respect their cultures and histories and acknowledge that their ancestral lands and waters form the historical geographic basis of the territory known today as Arizona. My name is Jeff Bannister, and I'm the director of the Southwest Center, and I'm also associate professor in the School of Geography. And assisting us today is the Southwest Center's outreach and community engagement coordinator, Carlos Quintero. Thank you, Carlos. And for those of you who don't know about the Southwest Center, I just want to say a brief word about that before we move on. We're a research and outreach unit in the University of Arizona College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and we have a threefold mission. One is to sponsor and facilitate research on the greater Southwest, also to publish exemplary work growing from that research, and to act in service to the citizens of the region through programs of teaching and outreach. And in all three of these areas, we give special emphasis to our ties with colleagues across the U.S.-Mexico borderlands and in the Republic of Mexico. So let me just say a couple quick words about the structure of the event, some housekeeping. I'm going to turn it over here in just a second to my colleague, Tom Sheridan. And then that'll be followed by a discussion with our panelists. And then at the end, we'll have, hopefully we'll have ample time for question and answer. And what we'll do is we'll allow people to unmute. If you want to signal to me that you have a question, you can just unmute yourself and ask it, or you can leave questions and comments in the chat box. And I'll do my best to make sure I can field all of those. And we'll also end the event at 1:30 because we know everyone has many things to do on this Friday afternoon. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And actually, finally, we're going to make this, this is going to be recorded, and we're going to make this available via our Southwest Center YouTube channel, probably in a week or so. We normally edit our talks and kind of, take out some of the superfluous stuff, and then we'll put those on our website. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn things over to my Southwest Center colleague, Dr. Tom Sheridan, who is a research anthropologist in the Southwest Center and also in the School of Anthropology. Tom, take it away.
Show a quick PowerPoint that will sort of locate the Altar Valley and give you a very brief introduction to the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance. So give me a moment, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, well, this is about ranchers and collaborative conservation in the Altar Valley, as Jeff mentioned. The Altar Valley is southwest of Tucson, and one of the first things we have to know about ranching is that even though ranches are managed as a unit, even though ranchers get loans from banks based on the entire ranch, most ranches in Arizona and the West are mosaics of land tenure, meaning that a ranch consists of not only the rancher's private land, but grazing allotments on federal lands like National Forest lands and BLM lands, and grazing leases on state trust lands. And here you can see a map of the Altar Valley by land tenure. The blue color are state trust lands. You have the Buenos National Wildlife Refuge in the southern part of the Altar Valley, and then a few pockets of BLM land, and a couple of ranches also have grazing allotments on Coronado National Forest. The valley is over 600,000 acres of largely high desert grassland, 9 private ranches that, again, are mosaics of land tenure, the large Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge, and only one major subdivision in the northern part of the valley, which is where I live. And in 1995, all of the ranchers came together to form the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance to promote watershed-wide conservation. Later on, 3 of the ranches in the valley and 1 cotton farm were purchased by Pima County with open space bond funds between 2004 and 2009. And the county then signed memorandums of agreement with the ranchers to manage the ranch as a working cattle ranch. Here are the 4 goals of the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance: to maintain and enhance open space while respecting private property rights, to continue the economically productive use of public lands, to undertake management measures designed to improve resource conditions in the valley, and to preserve Western cultural values and historic ranching communities. So the Alliance's vision of large landscape conservation very much is committed to keeping large portions of those landscapes as working landscapes, and in this case, working cattle ranches. It's the largest undeveloped watershed in eastern Pima County, and it meets the major criteria for biodiversity conservation. It's a large, unfragmented landscape. It has open wildlife corridors between the Babaquiviri Mountains on the west and the Sheridan and Cerro Colorado Mountains on the east. And it's one of 3 regions in the US where there have been confirmed sightings of jaguars. And AVCA supports jaguar conservation. And here you can see a picture of the famous Macho bee who hung out in the Altar Valley for more than 13 years. And the major challenge that the Alliance is trying to work on is, how do you accomplish conservation on the watershed level after the landscape's been fragmented into multiple jurisdictions? How do ranchers make their voices heard in the debate about what can and can't be done on public lands? How do ranchers, environmentalists, and agency personnel collaborate on landscape level, watershed level conservation? So this is very much an attempt to stitch the West back together and to realize John Wesley Powell's original vision of the West, organized by watersheds rather than abstract square townships and ranges. And very quickly, 2 of the major goals of the Alliance from the very beginning was, first of all, to restore grasslands through the reintroduction of natural fires and also carrying out prescribed burns. And John King of the Anvil Ranch, where Sarah King lives, was the first rancher in the valley to carry out prescribed burns. And he and his colleague, Dan Robinette, in the Natural Resources Conservation Service got very, very good results in the 1980s. The second is to restore gullies and watersheds that had become eroded in the valley, including Altar Wash. And Altar Wash becomes Avra Valley Wash, and then during floods, flows into the Santa Cruz River up by Marana. And so erosion control and restoring gullies became a second major goal of the Alliance. And we primarily focused on upland watersheds using low-tech, low-cost, low-risk measures that were introduced to us by Bill Zedike to heal these eroded gullies. And Marion and Sarah will be talking about this much more. The other thing we've learned from Bill Zedike is how do you build roads that don't erode? And here you can see an example of Bill Zedike and Steve Carson instructing a Pima County road crew. And here's an example of roads that don't erode and that channel the water off them into these wide takeaways that restore water to the landscape. And finally, all of the ranchers in the Altar Valley are in it for the long run, and they hope to see their children and their grandchildren ranching in the next 100 years. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Miller of the Elkhorn Ranch, one of the oldest ranches in the valley. And Mary is going to talk about the origins of the Alliance and what the Alliance did up till around 2015. And Mary was the first executive director, paid executive director of the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance. So Mary, take it away.
All right. Can everyone see me? I'm not using any PowerPoint today, but just wanted to make sure you could at least see my face. So I am Mary Miller, and as Tom said, I'm from the Elkhorn Ranch. We are a guest ranch located up against the in the foothills of the Babakeevre Mountains. Our neighbor to the north is the Anvil Ranch, and Tom is one of our neighbors here out here in the Altar Valley. We have a pretty broad definition of neighborhood. I'd like to just tell you a little bit about my background because it does feed into my story. I grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona, and throughout my childhood, I had the opportunity to come down to the Elkhorn Ranch as a guest. My grandparents visited here. And so this place and this valley were really part of my definition of home. Place I cared about really my whole life. I went on to go to school in New England and studied environmental studies, and then did master's work in natural resource management. And at that time, the word ecosystem management was quite the buzzword. So people were talking a lot about managing across boundaries, and I became very interested in that concept and spent a summer interning in the greater Yellowstone area, and went on to work for the Forest Service for a bit, and then for an environmental consulting firm. So I had a fair bit of exposure to various aspects of natural resource management at a pretty young age. I could never have planned the life that I now lead, in that I did marry into the Miller family in the mid-90s. And in fact, I had moved to Tucson, and I talked my boss at the time into letting me come to a meeting of what would become the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance with my boyfriend at the time, Charlie Miller. So this first meeting took place at the Anvil Ranch in their living room. And the genesis for all this was that Charlie Miller, my husband, and John King, our neighbor, had a conversation while watching a cattle sale about what was going on in the world, as one does at such an event. And they talked about how John King couldn't get his burns done. They talked about how big Tucson was getting, all sorts of things. And they also talked about this group that was getting going over in Southeast Arizona, the Malpai Borderlands group. And I would imagine that John probably got his wife Pat to arrange the meeting. Those two were pretty clever about having interesting ideas and then getting us to do all the work. But at any rate, Pat did pull off the meeting, and some folks from the Malpai came over, and the Kings invited various neighbors over, and we learned about what they had done working as neighbors. And the big project they had done at that time was a fire plan. They were trying to set things up so that if fire occurred, they could let it go if felt appropriate, or control it, but to have more of an upfront opportunity to work with the fire folks to try to have fires take place that would be good for the landscape. And we thought that was a pretty good idea in the Altar Valley. So we started to work on that project, and indeed produced an early fire management plan for the Altar Valley. The fancy word for that would be a prescribed natural fire plan. Again, an effort to have something in hand to help direct where fire might occur. So at that point, we were mostly still working as neighbors. We did have some close advisors, Dan Robinette with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, Kristen Egan, I think, was in there, a fellow named Carl Jones with at that time it was State Fire, but it was still mostly us working as neighbors. I would say at that time too that ranchers in the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge had a pretty uneasy relationship, given that the National Wildlife Refuge that takes up a good portion of the southern part of the valley had once been a very fine ranch, and then it moved into being a refuge, and things were still a little tense. So there was a certain amount of every meeting that involved a little bit of venting about all that. But regardless, we were getting things done. And we were pretty proud of ourselves for this plan until one day an advisor from the State Land Department kind of crushed us when he told us that he didn't think this plan was going to do any good because it hadn't had any permitting or any formal coordination with any of the agencies. And we were kind of crushed, but we are persistent folks. And so we continued on, and round about the same time, we applied to the Arizona Water Protection Fund for the funding to do a resource assessment for the valley. And we had a fellow named Nathan Sayer, who I think many people might have heard of. He was a anthropology PhD student studying various issues at the National Wildlife Refuge. And he became involved in many aspects of ranching during the time he was around, would have been sort of around 2000, give or take. And we had a very strong history component to this project. We did a lot of monitoring. We also looked at projects that we thought were important and wrote a typical report. And we also produced a series of maps. And one of these maps was, we called it our resource condition map. And it was very colorful. This was the early days of GIS, and it was a very beautiful, colorful map. And the middle part of it was very red. And the red was bad and the green was good. And we quickly saw that a lot of the red portions were along the major waterways of the valley. The Altar Wash, which flows from south to north, as well as a lot of its major tributaries. There were also areas that were quite green, where ranchers had prevented erosion from occurring in their areas. But this map just really helped us realize and understand the complexity of the problems we had in this watershed. It's really been a story of the conversion of grassland to brushy vegetation, mostly mesquite, and then also the story of erosion. Pretty heady stuff, pretty difficult problems, but at least we were starting to understand it. I think somewhere in here, just to get back to our history a bit, we did become a formal nonprofit organization. We had started to have some folks working on behalf of the Alliance. We were a volunteer-driven board, but our first, not really employee, but pseudo-employee was a fellow named David Seibert, who did a really awesome job of getting a lot of our on-the-ground projects underway. We were very fortunate to apply for and receive a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And we used that to prepare a number of prescribed fire plans, and also to begin to look at, we actually had 2 grants from that organization. So we did the fire plans, and then a second grant funded conducting the burns and adding some watershed restoration components to these project areas. So that kind of got us going on the ground, and roundabout in this area is when truly the partnership aspect of what we continue to do really came into being. The idea of getting out on the landscape to understand what's going on, to make plans, implement those plans. And that's where we really started to get to know people and start to form the team efforts and the collegial relationships that have really been a hallmark of what we've done. I want to pause a little bit to return to the notion of rivers in the desert. Looking at some of the names, I know a lot of you are from this area, but a lot of people I don't recognize. So if you're not from this area, we don't have a lot of water here in the Altar Valley, but we still have a lot of waterways. We call them arroyos, washes. They're river systems that are mostly dry, but they still behave like rivers and have all the same attributes of rivers. They have floodplains, they meander, their vegetation dynamic with them is very important. And I think one of the real breakthroughs that we had as an organization was in 2005, when we learned about the work that Bill Zedike was doing. Tom mentioned him earlier, but Bill Zedike was a Forest Service wildlife biologist who had a sort of a second career focused on restoration of waterways and helping people to really understand how water in the landscape worked. And in working with him, we began to really see all of the things that we could do in smaller parts of our river system, up in the tributaries. We could make a big difference in small areas. Even though we still had this really big challenge of the Altar Wash, which was many people had ideas about how to work on that, but it was pretty daunting. But working up in the uplands was something that individual ranches could do, volunteers could do. And that's really when we started to truly develop our partnerships. You know, I still remember people that in the first workshop we ever did, I remember being shoulder to shoulder, rolling big rocks with folks, and, you know, those relationships grew and grew, and it was fun out there. It was, even if you had things that you had to work on with folks that were difficult, you still had that common ground of having worked outdoors together. And we found that everybody could agree on the value of working on soil, water, and vegetation projects. Other things maybe you couldn't agree on, but these basics truly brought people together, and it seemed that everyone felt they were truly doing what they had trained to do, and the things that inspired them to get into resource management or environmental management. So at any rate, as we cruised sort of from 2005 up to 2010 and beyond, we were working actively on these fire projects, as well as a number of these small scale watershed projects. We also got diverted a fair bit working with Pima County on sort of regional planning efforts that, as Tom mentioned, in the long run they ended up buying land in the valley as part of their conservation programs. So, you know, having the organization, having done our resource assessment, we truly were qualified and had information such that we could have a seat at the table on big planning efforts like that. And I think for all of the ranchers, they could focus more on ranching, and they knew that there was an organization that was thinking about their concerns and sort of representing them. And that was a very powerful, useful thing through all these years. As we continued on, at some point we started to realize that we needed to have some staff to make this thing continue. As Tom mentioned, I was the first executive director, but I was not the first staff member. I think we first hired an administrative person, Sherry Steele, and then Sarah King was an early employee, a fellow named Kyle Thompson. So numerous great people. As the executive director, we did get to a point where we really needed to bring our team together, and it was a real honor to do that job. You know, thinking back to my education and my mention of the ecosystem management buzzword, I truly feel like being involved here, both in ranching and in the Alliance, has enabled me to be a very fortunate person who gets to study and work on the things that I, you know, truly was passionate about as a student, and now I'm, you know, continue that passion living and working here. I think one of my greatest sources of pride about this organization is the fact that we have kept going for over 25 years, and also that we have invested in sort of transitions and having the organization grow and evolve. And Sarah King's role as our executive director is, you know, a very important example of that, in that we have been adding people to our team and sort of having our leadership evolve and grow. And Sarah is my neighbor and close colleague and good friend. And with that, I will turn it over to her to continue the history from there.
Well, thanks, Mary. As Mary said, I'm Sarah King, and I also live and work in the Altar Valley. We live on the Anvil Ranch, which is on the north end of the valley, and my husband Joe and I are the 4th generation of Kings to be on the ranch, and our kids are the 5th generation. So we feel very strongly about this valley as a place that we call home, and as a watershed as a whole. And I'm also the executive director of the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance. And I started as the community outreach and education coordinator, which is still an ongoing piece of my role. As a small organization, a lot of us are wearing many hats and doing a variety of things. My background is not really in natural resources and not in agriculture either. I grew up moving around, and in 2nd grade through high school lived in New Jersey. And I also was an Elkhorn guest as a child, and then worked for both Elkhorns in Arizona and Montana for a little bit in high school, and then summers in college up in Montana, and then came down here to the Elkhorn after graduating, and met my husband Joe, and here we are, one thing led to another. So I'm really happy to be here and be part of this special landscape. So picking up where Mary left off, in 2015, the Alliance was really evolving from a organization that was a small organization, had worked on projects, was getting its feet under it, but was looking to transition more into paid staff, and what the next many years looked like. So In 2015, the Alliance hosted a watershed workshop up at the Elkhorn Ranch, and we pulled in about 30 or so partners. Some of you on this call, I think, were at that workshop. And it was really focused on talking about the altar wash, which, as Mary mentioned and Tom mentioned, was one of the founding elements of why the Alliance got started. And it had stymied people for many years, I mean, generations, even before the Alliance got going, but even as the Alliance got started and lots of good things were happening on the ground, there were still a lot of questions about what to do with the altar wash. And if you've ever been out here, particularly on the north end of the valley, it's a pretty deep cut that goes through, and when it's bank to bank, it's a lot of water that's moving through the landscape. It's not a simple problem. So this workshop was focused on drawing together a lot of minds to have these conversations, have these debates. You put in a big structure on the landscape in that wash, or do you do work in the uplands? On the Alliance put in a project in 2012 called the Elkhorn Las Delicias Demonstration Project that was focused on erosion control, low tech, a lot of the Bill Zeedyke methods that Tom Sheridan talked about before, those one rock dams and the like. So, you know, those are two very opposite ends of the spectrum of solving a problem. So that workshop was really focused on that. And there were several things that came out of it. And one was Mary Nichols pursued a lot of work related to structures already on the landscape and historical structures. And that's led to very important conversations about what human impact has been on the landscape in previous generations and over time, and how that impacts what we think about going forward, things that need to be maintained. So, you know, that's work that she's done herself, but has really informed what the Alliance has been thinking about. In that same vein, Pima County contracted with Jennifer Duan from the University of Arizona to do a look into the hydrology in the Altar Valley and look at various different hucks throughout the valley and talk about that. And that's been a big important piece of things that we've worked on in the last couple of years. And then also from that workshop, the Alliance launched our GIS system, which has evolved to include Arizona GIS and Robert Davis. And it's really a cutting edge system that for an organization our size is pretty incredible. And we owe a lot of that to Robert, but it's informed a lot of the work that we've been doing and how we've been thinking about the landscape as well. And then also coming out of that was the Altar Valley Watershed Working Group. And that's been a group of partners that were formalized out of that meeting. You know, a lot of folks that had already been working together for many years, but then became engaged in this watershed working group. And there is about 100 people or so on the mailing list at this point. And I'd say any given meeting has about 35 people. People flit in and out. And, you know, some folks are reading the stuff. Some folks are at every meeting. Some folks advise as necessary. But that was formalized coming out of this workshop that was put on in 2015. And then also with that was the hiring of J.E. Fuller, Geomorphology and Hydrology, by the Alliance to really take a look at the Altar Wash and develop recommendations and talk about what the next steps with that were. And then all that momentum led into the 2018 application that we put into the Bureau of Reclamation, which was for a Water Smart Phase 1 grant. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what that program does, it's really launching areas that are looking to develop a plan about their watershed and what to do in the future. So we were successful getting that grant. And for the last 3 years, from 2019 to March of 2022, we've been working on that process of creating the Altar Valley Watershed Plan, which you might note from those dates, the pandemic was in the middle of that. So we had some pivots from casual, you know, meeting in big groups in person, where there was room for discussion on the side, to switching to virtual meetings and getting adjusted. And we really credit the many, many years of meeting out on the landscape and having those meetings to lay the groundwork that let that transition be pretty seamless. People were still game to work together. And then it also, as things evolved, we realized that we could still get outdoors together and we could still meet on the landscape and look for project sites that we could talk about, examine, bring back then to these virtual discussions, and then, towards the end there again, in-person stuff. So what's come out of that is the Altar Valley Watershed Plan. And it is a collaboratively created plan by a variety of partners, anybody who has agency management, landowners, interest in the valley is invited to be part of that group and engage as much as they'd like. And there are also 4 technical teams: community, hydrology, vegetation, and wildlife are the 4 technical teams. And so folks can kind of self-select onto those to further advise about what went into the plan, and then also projects. And so the plan has elements that are kind of traditional planning that you think about, of shared goals, future of the landscape, some of the stuff that can wind up being in a plan that then gets tucked up onto the shelf and then not really pulled off, and everybody forgets about it and gets dusty. And our goal is really not to let that happen with this plan. It's designed to be living and evolving and engage people in decision making. And it's woven into our website, so it's very interactive. There's a GIS mapping component. There's certainly the very dense deep dive. If you feel like you need to do some heavy reading, it's all in there too. But then another really interesting part of the plan is the projects that were included. And we have 29 projects, I believe, that were included in the plan in these 15% plans is what we called them. And basically it was taking looking at a project, and we started with maps where people were putting sticky notes on and just identifying anything and everything that they could think of as being something where they'd seen an issue or that they wanted to talk about, and pulling together that diverse stakeholder opinion. So then once those were talked about and vetted, we did a lot of work to think about how much those plans might cost, what the permitting might look like, who the willing landowners were, either agencies or individual landowners, ranchers, that type of thing, what it would take to get that plan on the ground, and basically 15% of the planning to make that happen. So with that, then there was a template that we worked on, so that way they'd be standardized, and these all went into the plan and had some vetting by everybody who chose to take a look at them and do the deep dive. And those are also part of the plan. And it's designed to be reviewed each year and see what projects might be pushed forward in the next year, what projects are already being worked on, what projects are missing as things evolve. If there are changes on the landscape, either people or a flood event or something like that, then we've got this capability to edit and think about what else needs to be added and make this a dynamic plan. And then in that vein, as I'm sure some of you who are either soft money or going after grants know, it can be really easy when a grant opportunity comes along to say like, wow, that sounds like us. I'm sure we can develop something that can fit into that. And next thing you know, you're on target, but you're kind of trying to create something that'll fit into that niche. And these projects are really designed to switch gears a little bit on that, and to have these be vetted, be ready to go, and to be candidates. And then as funding opportunities come along, either that are open to the Alliance or open to different partners, to refer back to that plan and say, hey, what can we pull in? And maybe if it's a wildlife focused grant, then you write towards wildlife. If it's something that's focused on ranching or agriculture, you write towards that direction. But all these plans have a variety of co-benefits or multi-benefits. So there's a lot of dynamic ability to market them, but while still engaging in a vetted process that's got projects that are ready to go in the landscape. So we've already seen some of them getting out there on the ground. We also just put in another grant that the Alliance finished up last week. And so fingers crossed for us, if you would. And we're going to get that submitted, and that potentially has 5 different projects that would be drawn into this one element on the north end of the valley. So, getting that grant and kicking those off would be huge, in seeing the plan in action and seeing the next stage and phases of the plans. We still, I would say, Mary talked about bringing together people on the landscape, and I still think that's at the very heart of what the Alliance does. We've engaged a lot of folks in science and in doing things on the ground, but a lot of that is about bringing the neighborhood together. And like Mary was saying, our definition of a neighborhood is a little bit bigger than the standard one, but it is about, I tend to say people are hard to hate up close, that when you know them, you know about your family, their family, you hear about some of their challenges at work, or just know them as a person. There's a lot more leeway that goes into recognizing when there are shortcomings, or when somebody doesn't get back to you right away, or just thinking the best about people rather than assuming the worst. And I think that's a lot of what the Alliance does, and how we work together, and how we kind of leverage our little corner of the world, which is a pretty unique one, in that it's 600,000 acres of mostly undeveloped landscape and very close to a major metropolitan area with Tucson. That's a pretty unique phenomenon in the world at this point, particularly in the American West, to be that close to a large landscape and major metropolitan area. So in the vein of, when our successes have been highlighted, Mary talked about the prescribed fire program getting started, and over the years we've worked a lot on our fire program, and we've worked on getting prescribed fires out there. We've worked on wildfire preparedness and thinking about both of those, how those fit together, basically kind of some crisis planning with the wildfire stuff of how to, when there is a wildfire, how does communication happen, what can we get in front of during the off season, how does that go on the ground. Getting the right people talking to each other, getting different agencies talking to one another. And this past summer, some of you might be familiar with the Contreras fire that went up through Kitt Peak. That was probably the most news catching aspect of it. And it started on the southern end of our ranch and on the nation down there. It was a lightning strike that then went a little bit down onto the Elkhorn, and then came up through the mountains and worked all the way up north to Kitt Peak, and then kind of came off the backside there. But with that, it ended up being just shy of 30,000 acres. And at the height, there was a crew of 450 people on it, and people coming in from all over. There were local guys who started on it. Then as the fire grew and a different team came in, a lot of them were based out of Minnesota. And so very, very unfamiliar with our landscape, very unfamiliar with just everything. It was about 108 degrees the day that they came in, and they talked about fighting fires in canoes and paddling their stuff in on lakes and that kind of thing. So, just totally different experience. And their communications guy talked to Mary and I at length and really expressed what a unique area this was, not just because it was so toasty, but because of how the community interacted together, and the fact that we had this fire preparedness list of contacts that got engaged with early in the fire, brought neighbors together. People showed up to the fire meetings from the community to ask questions proactively, to get out in front of things rather than just emerging once they were mad at how something had taken place. And they were really impressed, and they asked a lot of questions about why that was. And we really feel that with the Alliance's presence and work over the years to engage neighbors and bring people together, that's been crucial to how things play out in a crisis and how we problem solve in this area. And, there's a lot these days of kind of folks standing on one side or the other and just yelling at each other across the void. And that doesn't really work. The polarization doesn't get stuff done. And we are getting stuff done out here, and we are solving problems both big and small, both kind of theoretical and stuff that's on the landscape as well. And we're really proud of that. And I guess I'll close up with leaving some time for questions, but close up with back in March of 2021, Senator Kelly sent a letter to President Biden talking about conservation on the landscape. And, specifically this concept of collaborative conservation, how things happen, what gets things done on the landscape, and problem solving. And he cited the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance in that letter, and quoted us as being an impressive partnership between the ranchers and the federal government. And we're really proud of that, to have our little engine that could out here that started from very humble beginnings, that looks to problem solve, looks to engage people, looks to find solutions, which I just think is so important, to find solutions that work for a variety of folks and solve problems. And to have that little engine that could mention from a sitting senator to a sitting president, that's pretty cool. And that's I think a pretty good testament of the scale that the Alliance is working on, and the partners and the thoughtfulness that we're drawing in. So we hope you've enjoyed this little snapshot. Thanks for being here today of what the Alliance does. And we're happy to take any questions at this point.
Well, thank you, Sarah and Mary, so much, and Tom as well for that. I just want to also say thank you for the amazing work that the Alliance is doing, and not only sort of the on the ground work that you're doing, literally, but also just for showing so many of us the way, because as Sarah, you were just noting, the extreme polarization that we're experiencing in this moment is, these problems are so complicated, and that's not doing us any favors. And so you all are actually really, on the ground working on these relationships, showing us how to protect landscapes, and, the kind of the human social element of that, and, engage with ecological processes is really critical. So thank you for that. Yeah, so we definitely have plenty of time for questions. And I'll do my best to manage the chat here as well, but you're welcome to raise your hand. Let's see, I think we do have one person. Yes, yeah, Brian, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, Sarah, Mary, Tom, thanks so much. And great presentation. And I've just always admired Altar Valley Conservation Alliance. And I just wondered if someone were coming from another watershed looking to do something like what you have been able to do for the last 25 years, what would you say some of the reasons for the success, kind of from an organizational standpoint, from a community, what are some of the key ingredients? Why have you been able to be so successful over so long?
Do you want to go first, Mary, or do you want me to chime in?
I would love to say something.
Go for it.
Dogged determination. And I think having people involved who are deeply rooted, who live here, and also recognizing that, as Sarah talked about, bringing people together, it is a process of continually bringing people together time and time and time again, and almost sort of developing traditions that make that happen, which maybe I'll turn it over to Sarah, but our community meeting, our fire coordination meetings, the watershed working group, we have sort of built traditions that bolster this. I don't know.
No, I totally agree that I think the dogged determination is huge. And sometimes, there's definitely stuff that we feel like, and particularly in engaging with agencies, there are folks who come and folks who go, and agency policy changes, or just depending on the person, how they interpret something changes. And you kind of do hit points when you're rebuilding on relationships that were there. And that can be frustrating then, of kind of, hey, we already put in the work, but just recognizing that that's the goal, and that's the goal, to keep building those relationships. And so to keep showing up and not feeling like those are setbacks that are insurmountable, but just keep engaging there. And I think our community meeting, as Mary said, is one of the best things that we do. And a lot of you here have attended one of those, but for those that haven't, it's now we have it at our ranch every spring. And it's an opportunity to gather in the valley. It's from 9 to 3, and we start with kind of morning targeted presentations that the Alliance will get speakers for. And then we have a long lunch hour, a solid hour. It's really just designed for people to network and have conversations with people that they wouldn't bump into otherwise, or had forgotten to talk to about this or that, or heard something from the morning, or, whatever combination of things. And then the afternoon is just agency updates, and folks have 5 to 10 minutes to go around and talk about what they're up to. And I think it's both positive in terms of building relationships between people, but I also think that when you're presenting, and I know I feel this when I talk about what the Alliance does or give a synopsis, you know, when you talk for 5 to 10 minutes about what you've been doing, it feels really good. You realize that you've been doing a lot. And, you know, particularly in the pandemic stretch, when there's been a lot of computer time and you're trudging through things and the day-to-day, you know, kind of feels squirrely. I think that bringing people together and giving them a chance to brag a little bit on what they're doing, and that's not how we bill it, but I think that's what it winds up being a little bit, and sharing that with your colleagues in the broader Valley, I think is a good shot in the arm for everybody. It's what they take back personally, and then along with the relationships that are built. So yeah, I just think those community meetings are crucial. And I think having social time to share with each other. One thing that Mary and I have talked about over the years is that a lot of the Alliance early stuff was focused on the social, because also if you get a bunch of ranchers together who've been hanging out at their own ranch and then are amongst the humans and delighted to see one another, that social piece of things is huge. But that there does come a point where it needs to be less social and more formal. That if you're going to have an Alliance meeting, you know, the importance of a meeting agenda for a meeting, the importance of having a start time and an end time, maybe even meeting during the day, so that way everybody's not tired at the end. You know, that transition to giving things some structure and giving the organization kind of the credit that it deserves and the respect that it deserves. I think that Mary would tell you, and I'll let her confirm here in a second, but that was a really essential part of the Alliance's successful building years and transition into being a solid organization.
Yes.
If I could chime in for a minute. I mean, I think, you know, the Alliance is a great example of collaborative conservation, and what collaborative conservation involves is identifying, you know, you have all these different interest groups. You have to identify where you have common ground. And as Mary so eloquently put it, when you're dealing with soil, when you're dealing with water, these are things that everybody agrees with. And then you sort of respectfully agree to disagree about other issues where you may not find common ground. And building trust and respect is so important. And the only way you do that is by sitting down with one another, or by going out on the landscape with one another, and you begin to realize that, hey, that rancher isn't the environmental scourge that I was led to believe, or that environmentalist isn't the zealot that others were led to believe. And I think that trust is so critical, but as Sarah alluded to, one of the problems in the agencies is staff turnover. You know, where people, you know, in order to advance in many agencies, they have to take a job someplace else. And I think what the Alliance has become after 25 years is a nexus that brings people together, and that in one sense holds the institutional memory of what people together have done in the watershed over the last 25 years. Because, you know, the ranchers in the Valley are here to stay. And I think it's critical to have that if you want to establish, you know, be successful at large landscape conservation. And I also believe that large landscape conservation has to incorporate working landscapes. There's not enough money or political will in the world to set everything, you know, aside as a natural protected area. So that's, those are my thoughts as, you know, not really an outsider, but somebody who's not a rancher.
Thank you, Tom. So we have two of the same question, more or less, in the chat box here. Let me see if I can, one's kind of long, so I'll see if I can do it justice. This is from Jana, and I apologize in advance if I botch people's names. The question is, are you aware of HB 2056 that recently passed the Arizona legislature? It's about dry washes. It's a permit program exemption that says dry washes, arroyos, swales, etc., and other similar features on private property are exempt from state permitting relative to dredge and fill and are not considered protected surface waters. Anyone care to comment on that?
Well, I will briefly. I am not up to speed on that, which perhaps I should be, but I guess I'm kind of building a little bit on what Tom and Sarah were saying. You know, I think one of the Alliance's survival mechanisms has been to be choosy about what we put our energy into. And clearly, a policy situation like this is a very important topic. The Alliance over the years has had many things of this nature. And what we have had to do is recognize that we all belong to many organizations, and we have tended to use other avenues that we as individuals are part of to tackle things of this nature. So the Alliance, with a few exceptions, but in general, the Alliance has steered clear of trying to be an advocacy organization. Clearly, this is an important topic. I do not have that much familiarity with it. I probably should, and I will be looking into it. But just kind of wanted to throw that out as kind of a real life example of how we've navigated. You know, and over the years, it has not always been peace in the kingdom. We've had a lot of challenging moments over laws of this nature, or, you know, policy topics of this nature. And Sarah's comment about being a bit more formal, agendas, facilitation. We've had some false starts, and have learned the hard way that we have to really use those tools to make our meetings and events sort of a productive, safe place to be. And that has been a really important part of things. So kind of warped that question a little bit, but.
We have a request on the part of Joaquin to speak, and I'm gonna let you do that just a minute, Joaquin, but I have one quick follow-up. There's someone who wrote a follow-up to that question, which was Chris, who says, I have the same concern as Jana regarding the legislation. Overall, there's a general lack of understanding about waterways when they are dry. Their significance for natural diversity, ecological function, and human well-being is large. And there is a great need for building that understanding. I think that's a really important comment. I can imagine, you know, in the arid West, particularly because we're a region of constant waves of newcomers who come from regions that are oftentimes more well-watered, that is, you know, that perception is something that needs to be dealt with. I don't know if anyone cares to comment on that, but I just thought I would throw that out there.
No, I think certainly water on the landscape has been a big part of the Alliance's conversation, and that's you know, a lot that's gone into the Altar Wash is just when it's dry, it can be really hard to envision how much water is moving through there, and what that landscape looks like in a wet environment. So definitely part of the big conversation out here.
Okay, Joaquin, would you like to ask a question?
Sí, claro que sí. This is Joaquin Murrieta from, I'm calling from Borderlands Restoration Network. And Mary Miller, thank you so much for sharing your love story. I love that story. And also your relationship with the landscape, same as Sarah and Tom. Thanks for sharing that. And my question is in the sense of you are on a very significant, culturally strong landscape. And how are you working, relating, sharing your love with the Tohono O'odham Nation, for example? And if there are any relationships with the ranching community of the O'odham Nation in terms of collaboration and sharing experiences of the love of the landscape.
Why don't you start this one?
All right, I'll start this time. So I would say that it's an ongoing process. I think in a lot of ways we've traditionally been in our own little silos. And so figuring out how to have those conversations can be hard. I think that when we've had success, I think this across all of the work that the Alliance has done, not just with the TO, but with anybody, that when there's something concrete to work on together, that we've had the most success, rather than just hey, we should hang out sometime, we should be friends, and that's hard to maintain. Everybody's busy, everybody's got their own stuff going on. So recently, in the last couple of years, we've been working on a mass bobwhite quail safe harbor agreement. And Mary touched on this a little bit, but so the Refuge is on the southern end of the Altar Valley, and it was formed in 1985 and focuses on the mass bobwhite quail reintroduction down there. And they've been having some success in the last couple of years, and the refuge manager at the time approached the Alliance and said, the quail is probably going to start to spread off of the refuge, and we'd really like to work with the safe harbor, with you all on a safe harbor agreement, so that way this can be a positive thing for the species, for the ranchers, for conservation actions, for the refuge, all those layers. And so we got started working on that. And then I forget at exactly what point after the start of things, we wound up talking to the Tohono O'odham about lands that might be affected by this as well, and whether or not they'd be interested in participating in this safe harbor process. And they responded with a yes, and we're enthusiastic about it. And it's been a long process. The document is written and finished, but it needs to go through the official Fish and Wildlife Service application and process. And some of that's been waiting for the TO to get back to us about district approval and that kind of stuff. And so, engaging on that plan, I think, has opened pathways for the future, has given us contacts, has given us something to work tangibly on together. And to me, that's where the most success comes from. I'll let you take it from there.
I don't have a lot to add, but again, tangible is key. The world of fire has brought a lot of people together. Again, a little bit crisis driven, but I think that when there are concrete things to do, we do them pretty well together. But it is still, there's a very solid fence line along the mountains with no trespassing signs. So it is challenging. There are ways in which the relationships are porous, and then there are other ways in which there are very definite kind of hard boundaries. But I think it's something that we keep working on. A personal dream of mine is to try to find some opportunities to do some pilot projects on the nation with some of our watershed restoration projects, the rock work. A project like that could be a really wonderful thing to do together. And I think neat to get youth involved, neat to get schools involved. So that's the kind of thing that maybe other organizations with these interests could get in on as well.
At this point, I'd just like to put in a shout out to Julia, our
Yes.
coordinator of science and conservation. Julia, I'm probably going to botch her last name now. The former Julia Sittig, Julia Guglielmo.
Yep, that's it, Guglielmo.
Who wasn't able to join us today, but you know, she's half-time at the Alliance, and all of the projects that Sarah's been talking about, Julia has been a huge part of organizing those projects and seeing them through. And we've been so lucky to find people in the Alliance, you know, who either, in Mary and Sarah's case, live out here, and in Julia's case, you know, who are so passionate and so committed to large landscape collaborative conservation. It really, you know, at a time, as Jeff said, when we're so polarized, it's one thing that gives me optimism is to see what the Alliance has been able to accomplish by bringing people together on tangible projects where we insist on respect for one another's positions.
Thank you, Tom. Let's see, we have a couple more questions in the chat box. One from Jennifer. What does the future hold for AVCA? What do the next 30 years look like for you in an ideal world?
Can I start and you can finish this one, Sarah?
Go for it. Yep.
Well, I think it's really, when we did this watershed plan, the concept of that plan was to look 25, 30 years into the future. And we really can't emphasize enough that the way in which this report is devised, or that this plan is devised, is meant to be living and breathing. We wouldn't have even written a 90-page report if we didn't kind of have to. The real guts of it is GIS based, it's accessible, it's about shared ideas, questions, concerns, visioning, and projects. And I think what we've really done is create a framework that we can continue to return to as a community. And it's a framework that hopefully, if I'm not around, if Sarah's not around, you know, if those of us who someday won't be around can keep using these tools, we provide a way to keep all of this going. And there was another question about sort of more projects. You know, every project we do has a chance to be a learning opportunity. All of our projects, we bring people together on the ground. We have the watershed working group. All of these projects are, you know, doing opportunities and learning opportunities. So to me, that's what it's about, is to continue that process. I think we're going to have, I know here, my husband, who's really our grassland manager, has a lot of concerns about species and climate. I think we're going to really have to keep talking as practitioners and as a scientific community. We've got some tough stuff ahead of us to think about, but I think if we can think about slowing down the water, keeping those drops as close to where they fell as possible for as long as possible, that is a key that we can all kind of hang our hats on. So.
Yep, that's very much in sync with what I was going to say. I think the watershed plan's key to, you know, all the groundwork that was laid to that, getting that out onto the landscape. And I think also just consistently showing up in the way that we've showed up and engaging partners. And, you know, I whenever we do the fire meetings or the community meetings, I'm usually the planner for both of those. And every time I have this moment of like, this is going to be the year that nobody shows up, that I bring the coffee and then I'm the only one standing there drinking it. And every year, everybody shows up and they're excited and they're engaged and they're problem solving. And it turns out to be an important meeting, and they all look a little different, but each year has its driving force. And I think the Alliance showing up in that way is going to continue to be critical.
I think now's a good time to acknowledge one of our most important partners, which is Pima County. And the fact that Pima County for the last, almost as long as the Alliance has been in existence, has pioneered this incredibly visionary land use plan called the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan that Brian Powell is a big part of. And it also is a living, breathing experiment and has a really strong presence in the valley because it has bought 3 ranches in the Altar Valley and as well as Buckaloo Farms. And the Alliance and the county work very, very closely with one another, and both are looking, down the road 25 to 50 years.
Okay, let's see. We have a couple more questions in the chat box. This one is from Christina, who says, I appreciate all this history and kudos for staying strong over the last 25 years. That's a huge accomplishment. Could one of you discuss your recent restoration workshop and plans for more pilot sites that might help inform others outside the Alliance?
Jump in on that one. Julia, as Tom mentioned, would be the ideal person to fully answer that as she led the workshop, but actually she's over in kind of a full circle moment. She's over at the Malpai Borderlands Group Science meeting today, and she's presenting about the Altar Valley Watershed Plan. So that way they can learn from the recent work that we've done. So kind of a cool full circle moment, and kudos to Julia for heading over there to spearhead that talk. So anyhow, we did an installation on the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge. So, again, a reflection of that partnership that's grown over the last 25 years or so. As the Alliance got started, certainly thinking about installing projects on the Banwar would not have been anything that was remotely possible. So cool layer there. And then the workshop was inspired in part by the Elkhorn Las Delicias site that I talked about earlier. And it's Bill Zedike methods of one rock dams and erosion control structures at a couple different sites. And Brad Lancaster and Omar Orgeron and Kyle Thompson and Julia led the workshop along with Lil John, who does a lot of road work. And there were a variety of participants that were out there for the week, and hearing Julia talk about that workshop, Mary and I were busy writing this grant that was mentioned before, so we were unable to make it to the workshop. Another example of divide and conquer. But she talked about what a dynamic exchange it was, a dynamic exchange of the folks who were there as the students, who brought their knowledge from various different things, and the instructors learning from one another, and then how that engaged with getting everything installed and thinking about the future. She had one person who told her afterwards that it probably resulted in a career change for him, and that he's totally shifting what he's thinking about and intends to pursue this. So obviously only time will tell if that exactly happens, but I think that's a pretty cool reflection of the workshop, and something that we find to be true with these workshops, that they really provide hands-on experience, and people love to engage with the land in that form. So in terms of thinking about the future, that's part of what we're considering working on in this grant that we just put in for. And part of the watershed plan identifies that these type of projects are critical to the watershed health, and would be great to install at a variety of sites across the valley. So definitely more work coming in that vein, and not necessarily specific sites installed or identified at this moment, but have done some mapping that identifies possible areas. And then as opportunities come up and people are ready to, landowners and agencies are ready to engage, we definitely see installing more of those in the future.
Okay, let's see. There's a little bit of a side chat going on in the chat box. Some of you are asking about meetings and opportunities and things. And thank you, Mary, for you provided some links in there. And we can help out with that too. You can always get in touch with us here at the Southwest Center for further information if you need. Let's see, a question here from Griffin, who says, I'm a grad student at Central Washington University. My thesis research is on sediment retention structures installed in a local watershed up here. So the AVCA surface water work is very applicable here. Earlier rock dams were mentioned as a tool being used. Are these dams being used predominantly for just incision control, or are they also being used for wetland preservation?
I would say a little bit of all of that. We don't have a lot of wetland areas in the valley. There is some of that in the AVCA area, and large rock medialunas were used in a Sackatone grassland area in one of our early projects. We've used the rock in eroding channels, and we've also used rock outside of channels to work on sort of grassland enhancement. So we've done both. There's some really great new literature out there that I just read, a Laura Norman article that really summarizes a lot of this. Maybe one of you who is better with scientific literature could find that reference, but I would highly recommend taking a look at it.
I
ahead,
think
Tom.
we also, I mean, have we put up our, the Alliance website? Because there's a tremendous amount of information on the website about former and current projects.
Yeah, Mary provided a link in the chat box there for the Alliance.
And a shout out to Rodrigo Renteria and his students from Central Washington. One of my favorite former students.
Viva Ellensburg. Okay, let's see. There was a comment here from someone. Let me see. I'm just scrolling down. Give me a second. Oh, Richard Collins. But I think that it may have gotten truncated here. So Richard, you're welcome to if you're still with us, you can ask that question again, or that statement. It's about Malpai having their scientific meeting today, and then the rest got cut off. So let's see, just scrolling down. Yeah, I think that's all the questions we have so far, and we have about 10 minutes left if anyone wants to. Rodrigo, go ahead.
Thank you much, Scenes. Thank you, Tom, for going. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Since my name was invoked, I will take the opportunity to once again thank everyone for this amazing opportunity. We're here with some students for Central Washington University who are like taking a class on issues and conflicts on environmental resource management at the master's level. And so in that sense, this could not be a more timely, relevant conversation. So we really appreciate the opportunity to join you here. And just a very quick question that was kind of answered already, but from this lens of this specific class, I wanna bring in again. Can you share a little bit about in this context of radical opposing views, right? I remember Tom many years ago sharing the story about how you find common ground, sometimes not first conceptually, but through food, through a carne asada, right? And the power of food to like first help us find the humanity in the people that we are interacting with. Because in a circumstance, in a situation where you have so many different perspectives, you have scientists and ranchers and policymakers and politicians and whatnot trying to work together, it's very easy to just see what these people represent officially, right? But the challenge is, and I think this alliance has showcased the power of doing that, not just the art of finding a common ground, but once you find that common ground, to build a momentum along 25 years. So in that sense, that is something that at this point is an enormous value for all of us to learn about, to get inspiration from, because the alternative is an ever fragmented landscape, an ever fragmented viewpoints, right? And so in that sense, there's so much to rescue about what you have achieved here that we are really striving to pass to future generations of natural resource manager and partners and local stakeholders. So thank you for that.
I feel that, you know, if you look at the number of place-based organizations that have sprouted up across the West, I think there's a really important clue there. I think that the power of place can really help bring people together. So if you have that common ground and then sort of an agreed upon agenda of what you can work together on, that's the key. And you have to also be willing to say that there are things we cannot work on together, and you have to be able to table those and encourage people to pursue those concerns in other ways. And that's where I think the kind of the professional focus that Sarah spoke of is critical. The Alliance has had some meetings where that did not occur, and damage was done to important relationships. And so we learned that the hard way, and we don't forget those moments. So, but I do think place is really key. And in some areas, it might be a very small place, and others it might be larger, but I think that's, and I think the nonprofit sector plays a very important role in organizing people around those places. So I don't know if in terms of how to, I think that's important. And it's interesting that the grant program for which we got funding for the watershed plan with the Bureau of Reclamation, they call it Water Smart. And it's sort of interesting that they recognize institutionally that these place-based watershed groups seem to have a particular knack. I think it's kind of interesting to see how government does respond to these things. And I think that's an interesting example there.
A little moment of sort of self-promotion. Gary Nabhan, Susan Charnley, and I co-edited a volume called Stitching the West Back Together that talks about many of these different groups in both forestry and ranching communities. So if any of you are interested in learning about how some of the organizations Mary mentioned have approached similar challenges, this book might be a good introduction.
Thank you, Tom. Should they just send checks directly to you?
I've been giving the book away, Jeff.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Mary, for sharing. We are reading the book, Tom. We have been using that book for a few years, and yes, it's an amazing reference to like across the whole West, like different case studies for students to really get a sense of the key topics, the key challenges in conservation. So thank you, everyone. Much appreciated.
And I didn't even have to pay Rodrigo to say that.
So a couple quick things in the chat box that have popped up here. Carlos included a link to the book, so you can just click and get to it. Yeah, there you go. Benjamin says, sincere interaction with others is the food that fuels friendships. Very cool that you have accomplished very cool what you have accomplished as a community. Here. And then Christina says, in reference to a comment made earlier about some studies, Dr. Laura Norman has a number of articles of interest, including a paired watershed study in the Chiricahua Mountains, comparing what the Austins did on the El Coronado Ranch, rock dams, etc., beginning in 1983, to an untreated watershed just to the north. The Austins' work restored flowing water to the Turkey Creek area, but it does require ongoing monitoring and maintenance. Yeah, okay, so just comments of support here. We are at almost 1:30, so I think it might be just good to ask if Mary, Sarah, Tom, if you have some parting comments, words of wisdom, observations that you would like to make before we close down for this afternoon. Not to put
I
you-
think you got all my wisdom, and that's it for me.
Just a sincere thanks for the opportunity to visit with so many smart, passionate people.
Yeah.
I think the Alliance has been very lucky to have such amazing women as its leaders. Mary, Sarah, Julia, Pat King, they have really been the heart and soul and drivers of the Alliance.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks for that, Tom. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. Mary and Sarah and Tom, thank you to you very much. This has been most enlightening. And again, I just want to remind everybody that if you want to see this again or pass the conversation around, we're going to have a videotaped version available on the Southwest Center's YouTube channel in a week or so. We just need some time to kind of edit things a little bit. So again, thanks everyone, and hope you have a lovely rest of your day and weekend. Take care.